Hello and welcome. This is the Apologetics Academy. My name is Jonathan McClatchy. I'm the host of the Apologetics Academy. Every Saturday, I run a live interactive apologetics webinar where we bring on different scholars, apologists, authorities, experts from across the theological and philosophical spectrum to present on topics of interest to Christians, particularly those topics which pertain to the question of whether or not the gospel is true. And we also cross-examine and evaluate competing worldviews, including Islam, Mormonism, atheism, and so on. There's a number of ways that you can participate in this live interactive program. You can simply watch and listen anonymously if you so want. You can also participate in the chat window. Please, if you're doing so, submit your chat to everyone rather than just panelists. That would be great. You can also submit questions in textual form anonymously if you wish by hitting the Q&A button at the top of your screen and typing in a question. You can also click the raise hand button, and I will promote you to be a co-panelist with our guest speaker, and you'll have the opportunity to interact and engage in dialogue with him, raise disagreement, ask for clarification, and so on. If you're a non-believer, particularly welcome your participation. Just to give you an idea of what's coming up in the upcoming weeks, next Saturday on June 10th, I'm actually going to be giving a webinar on undesigned coincidences in the scriptures, an argument of their veracity. And we're looking at the argument from undesignedness and how we can use it to corroborate certain aspects of biblical history and also to corroborate the authorship of various books of the Bible. The following Saturday on June 17th, we have Mary Jo Sharp of Confident Christianity, who's going to be giving us a presentation on the status of women according to Islam. And then the following Saturday, on June 24th, we have Dr. Brian Miller of Discovery Institute, who's going to be giving us a presentation on thermodynamics and the origins of life. And you can find the website at apologetics-academy.org. If you click on online apologetics training, then it will take you to the upcoming webinar schedule. And of course, there's also a YouTube channel where you can check out past recordings of previous shows, and that is linked to at the website as well, apologetics-academy.org. So coming back to this evening, we have with us, we're very honored to have with us Dr. Jeff Zweerink, who is an astrophysicist who is involved with Reasons to Believe, which is a Christian apologetics ministry. It's a think tank on the science and faith intersection. And he's going to be giving us a presentation and fielding questions on the subject of, is the multiverse an information generating machine? The multiverse is often used in order to solve problems in the sciences, including the origins of, or to account for the existence of the information that's contained in living systems. And so Jeff's going to be giving us a presentation on the scientific discoveries that identify the information content in living systems and addressing whether the multiverse provides an adequate explanation. So Jeff, for those that maybe haven't come across you before, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself and then just bring up your PowerPoint and launch into the presentation? That would be awesome.
Sure, yeah. So as Jonathan mentioned, my name is Jeff Zweerink. My training is in astrophysics. I have been interested in science for as long as I can remember. My dad was a chemist, and I just really enjoyed his job. And so I've just been interested in science for as long as I can remember. Was going to be a chemist until I took physics my senior year of high school and just fell in love with physics, and then actually changed to an astrophysics emphasis when I went into graduate school, because that just seemed to be the place where science and Christianity overlapped more. And so I've been studied high energy astrophysics processes. So these are gamma rays and black holes and neutron stars and dark matter, kind of the high energy exotic stuff in the universe. That's kind of my scientific training. I have been involved with Reasons to Believe on a full-time basis for a little bit over a decade, just investigating everything from the multiverse to Big Bang cosmology to planets and is there life out there. Just looking at how can I develop resources that encourage Christians to know that their faith is solidly grounded, and also so that they're willing to go out and share it with others. I know that I know that I cannot, or where I am worried about running into something where I don't know or I'm unsure whether it's true, it makes it difficult to talk confidently about it. And so that's really kind of my interest, is just to equip people, one, to know what the science has to say, what it doesn't have to say, what the Bible has to say and what it doesn't have to say, just to a way to equip and help people to be confident. And so that's kind of one of those areas where I have been dealing with, that is the multiverse. And this was a topic I ran into again a couple of decades, or almost 2 decades ago now. I was at a scientific conference and giving a talk on my research, and we ended up having a conversation around the dinner table. There was about 10 of us talking about whether theological ideas or religious ideas had any place in the scientific discussion. And I was kind of making a case that you can actually have, there are testable ideas of what Christianity has to say. It talks about there's a beginning to the universe. It talks about how there's design in the universe and how God created things for a purpose, and that as we investigate, we ought to be able to see some of those things. And so, it's kind of naturally talking about Big Bang cosmology, the design and the laws of physics to permit carbon and oxygen and hydrogen, which gives you water and planets and places where life could exist. And so we're having that big, long discussion. And, in all honesty, I really didn't say a lot. I kind of threw some ideas out there, and the people at the table, we'd bat them around for quite a while. And at some point in there, I made a statement. I goes, as I look at all this, I see there's a beginning to our universe and there's a design to our universe that seems to point to a creator. And this fellow across the table, a fairly prominent geologist, looked at me. He goes, "Yeah, that's all fine and dandy, but in which universe are you talking about?" And see, this was a time where the multiverse was just beginning to grow in popularity. And I have to say, at the time, I didn't have a good answer. I said, I didn't know. And in all honesty, that was a place where I thought the multiverse was a threat to the Christian faith. If the multiverse existed, then how could Christianity be true, was my thinking at the time. And so I've actually spent quite a bit of time thinking about the multiverse, analyzing what does it have to say, why do scientists think it's a possibility, is it, and interacting with how Christians have talked about it. And I've found that there are some really good things about the multiverse, there are some troubling things, and that there's also good and bad ways to interact with it. So that's kind of what I hope to share as we go through the course of the session today. And so a few years ago, I developed a talk, is the multiverse an information generating machine? In part to address a question of whether it can answer whether it can answer everything without any need for a God. And so, one of the first questions I thought in addressing that is, one, do we have any evidence for information in the universe? It could just be that as we look at the universe, there's nothing that requires anything beyond the laws of physics. Or I guess I'll state it a different way, that there are certain ways we put things together that you look at them and you say, okay, that's interesting, that's fascinating, but it also communicates something. And so I just kind of sat down and thought, okay, do we have any solid evidence that there's information or things that are being communicated through what we see? And one of the places that I think is the most remarkable example of that is when we look at the genetic code. Now, I'm not a biologist and I'm not a geneticist, and so there's a whole lot that I'm just going to gloss over here, but there is one particular aspect of the genetic code that I do have a fair bit of experience with. Because what we see in the genetic code is there are U's and C's and A's and G's. Those are the letters of the genetic code. And I remember even in my high school biology class that you've got these sequences of 3 that specify certain things. And so, you have 3 U's in a row and that says one thing, or a U, C, and an A, and that says something else. And it turns out that what's going on there is those letters of the genetic code specify what amino acids are produced. And so, when when you now start stringing those together, so you got various amino acids that are being produced, and as those amino acids are put together in long strings, you make proteins, and those proteins, as they fold and interact with one another and with themselves, those are the workhorses of the cell. They accomplish most or a whole lot of the tasks of what goes on inside the cell. And so the genetic code is actually responsible for communicating to the environment around how to build these proteins, which are the workhorses of the cell. Now, if you say, all right, there are sequences of 3 and there are 4 letters, you can actually ask the question, how many different combinations are there? Because you can have 4 combinations for the first, or 4 possibilities for the first letter, 4 possibilities for the second letter, and 4 possibilities for the third letter. And that gives 4 times 4 times 4, which is 64. So there's 64 different options that are out there. Now, what we found from an empirical standpoint is that there are only 20 amino acids that are used in biological systems. And so you've got 3 letters that specify an amino acid. 20 of them, there are 20 different amino acids, but there are 64 different combinations or possibilities out there. What that means is that there can be some redundancy there. Either you have a whole bunch of sequences, or sequences of 3 that don't do anything, which is one possibility. Or again, practically speaking, what we found out is that different sequences of 3 can often have the same effect. So if you look in the upper right-hand corner of this, UUU and UUC both produce the amino acid called phenylalanine. And then you look right below that, there actually looks like 7 different combinations, or maybe it's 6 different combinations that produce leucine. And some of them only have 1. You go down about 3, or down a little bit further in that left column, and you get AUG produces a methionine. So there's some variability in how many of these amino acids, or how many sequences produce the amino acids, and what you get. So that actually fills up, and it turns out that all 64 different combinations do something in producing an amino acid. Now, this is what's interesting about that, is that there's a code in the genetics that produces the amino acids. And the amino acids then lead to what proteins form, and those proteins, how they fold and how they interact with themselves, is actually what gives all the function. So this code is producing something, it's communicating information to actually produce a particular outcome. What's fascinating about this, though, is that when scientists now go in and analyze how robust is this code in terms of the amino acids that are being produced and the function that you get, how robust is this code to errors being introduced? Now, I know this. I write a lot of code. I taught myself how to program in C when I was in graduate school. That was just one of the necessary requirements for the work that I was doing. I've spent 20 plus years doing programming. My latest one that I'm kind of specifically proud of is that we had a balloon experiment where I wrote the data acquisition code for the system. And what this code would do is it would sit there and listen for, it did a number of things, but one of the things that it sat and listened for commands being sent up from the ground. And so it had a thread that was sitting there just listening for these commands coming in. And when it got a command, it would then tell other things to happen. So it knew how to handle all the codes, or all the commands as well. It would also be sitting there waiting for, listening for a piece of hardware to generate a trigger. And if it generated a trigger, it would then send out a command to read out all of the hardware, put that into an array, go back and then say, all right, rearm itself so it's waiting for another trigger. And while it's going off listening for that other trigger, it would write out that data to, or store the data in a particular way, write it to a hard drive, manage that all in parallel so that we could be live and taking triggers. And it could have a whole lot of data in the buffer, even, so it could have multiple triggers come in before it actually wrote anything out. It handled all that independently. It also just periodically triggered the system and read everything out. And then it also did things to set up how the system was taking data. And so it handled all of that. And I was particularly proud of this. The day that it flew, I forgot we were flying that day because I'd have been very worried about it wasn't going to work. Because if my system didn't work, we're not going to get any data. And at the end of the day, it came back and it worked very well. And I was very pleased with that. But one of the things I found in doing all of that coding is that getting a computer to do what I want to do is actually pretty straightforward. If I want to add two numbers, you write, there's 2 or 3 lines of code that will get it to add 2 numbers or organize some numbers. The hardest part of coding, or what takes the bulk of my effort when I'm writing the code, is not getting it to do what I want it to do. It's handling all the errors that could come up from who knows where. Sometimes that's because people put in the wrong information. They give it a file that has the wrong format. It gets into a loop and it can't, it's just expecting something and it doesn't get it. There's all sorts of ways where the code could break. And most of my programming skills go into finding those and figuring out how to deal with them so that it does what it's supposed to do, regardless of the environment it's in. Why do I go into all that detail? Well, when we look at the genetic code, that's one of the things it's doing. And when we see how there are 64 options, but only 20 of them are used and they're redundant, what we see is that the genetic code is actually very good at minimizing errors. And what I mean by minimizing errors is that when something weird happens, either the system produces, in response to the error, the system still produces the amino acid as it's supposed to, or the error moves it to a place where it produces another amino acid that for all intents and purposes works the same way. So the cells keep working and life keeps functioning even in the midst of a whole bunch of errors. Now, scientists have actually gone in and quantified how good is the genetic code at error minimization. And so here's a bell shape, just your standard bell curve, and it, I'll come to that in a few minutes, but we can ask, where's the genetic code, our natural code? That's the sign there off to the left. Where does it sit in terms of this ability to minimize errors? And you'll notice that it's way off to the left where the numbers are very small. So the average code error was 8 there, and the genetic code is down around 2.6. And so just to kind of give a sense of what does that mean? Just put on here, we can talk about IQs, and we're not talking about IQs in terms of assessing talent or stuff, but that's a way of kind of understanding how outside the norm something is. Because in IQs, 100 is normal, that's average. There's half the people have less than that, half the people have more than that. When you get up to 130, that's typically when you're dealing with people with an IQ of 130. These are pretty bright people. This is not your run-of-the-mill person here typically. Used to be that Mensa had a genius level was 150, and there's just not a lot of people in that. When you get all the way up to an IQ of 170, this is kind of how good the genetic code is. It's a very rare phenomenon. It really is literally 1 in a million. So if there's 1 billion people in the world, there's maybe 1,000 of them that have an IQ of higher than 170. That's how good the genetic code is. And even more than that, the genetic code resides at a global optimum. That when you ask the question, how could you get better? It's not as though there's a whole bunch of places where you could be this good. It's actually really kind of at the high point of how good it could be. So that's one really remarkable thing about the genetic code. But even more than that, you've got the genetic code, and it actually has these letters, the sequences of letters, but it's also, the genetic code is wrapped up in specific ways. And if you look on this picture, you can see it's kind of wrapped around the balls. And then there are these histones, those kind of little yellow blobs of stuff, proteins, and then the green balls in between. It turns out that those histones actually have a code in them as well, or they code for certain things. So in other words, there's the genetic code, which is the letters, the U, A, C, and G, but then there's these histones that have a code written on top. because there's the one layer of code, and then there's a whole nother layer of code written. It's kind of like in my code, every 10th letter is part of another code. So I can't just rearrange this subroutine because that's going to interact with the second layer of code. Scientists have known for a long time that the genetic code has these multiple layers of code. Not only that, that you can actually show that the genetic code, the universal genetic code, that means what every living organism has this same genetic code, that it can efficiently carry arbitrary parallel codes better than the vast majority of other possible genetic codes. So again, just to state that clearly, we can envision how other genetic codes would work, or we can envision other genetic codes and then do the analysis. How well does it minimize errors, and how well does it allow for multiple layers of parallel code? And it turns out that our genetic code, the one that all life on Earth shares, is better than the vast majority of possible genetic codes. What I take that to mean is that there is definitely information stored in the genetic code. No one would look at a computer program that does a lot of complex things and say there's no information there. So I think, to me, this is pretty convincing evidence that there's information in the universe. You know, we see that the genetic code displays optimization, there are overlapping codes, and that it's optimized to arbiter them. So I think this is just, to me, if somebody wants to say there's no information, the burden of proof is on them to explain why there isn't any information. How the genetic code works argues strongly that information exists. And, you know, this is not a new or surprising thing. I mean, even back when the double helix nature of the DNA code was discovered, you know, Francis Crick, who was one of the people who discovered this and won the Nobel Prize for it, he said, you know, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. You know, and I take that as a statement that when people look at what we see specifically inside the cell, that they see evidence of design, they see evidence of information, they see evidence that reminds them of things that are designed. So I'm just going to go from here with the premise that the information exists and we see design in the cell and in the universe. And so now this moves us to the kind of a more parallel question with that is, how does the multiverse address this issue? Now, what I will say is that in order to answer that question, we have to understand what the multiverse is. So here's, as I've went out and just was trying to address what is the multiverse, I typed it into Google one time and I ran across this cartoon that I loved. You know, it's a dad sitting with his daughter in bed reading a story, and the daughter turns and goes, "Dad, what's a multiverse?" And the dad goes, "Well, it's a plot device for lazy writers." And what I find amusing is that as I've gone out and watched movies, it's interesting how often the multiverse comes up as a way to solve a problem in a way that's convenient, but it isn't actually, it doesn't get in and wrestle with the difficult parts of the problem. But that's not really what I'm interested in today. So how do we think about a multiverse? Well, to me, in order to think about a multiverse, I have to understand what the universe is. And that's not a trivial thing to define, believe it or not. So this is the way I've come up with defining it. So here's an object that we're familiar with. This is the moon. When we look at the moon, we actually do not see the moon as it appears right now. We see the moon as it appears roughly 1 second ago, because that's how long it took the light to get from the moon to our eyes. So we're seeing the moon from the past. Specifically, we see the moon from 1 second ago. If we go out a little farther, we go to the sun, that's about 8.5 minutes. Takes the light that long. So if the sun were to go out right now, we wouldn't know it for 8.5 minutes. If we go a little farther away, we go out to the Andromeda Galaxy. Light from the Andromeda Galaxy takes 2.5 million years to propagate from that galaxy to us. So again, when we look at the Andromeda Galaxy, we're not seeing it as it is today. We're seeing it as it looked 2.5 million years ago. As we continue to go farther and farther away from the Earth, we get out to the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. Now, there are some things in here that are only a couple of billion light years away, and others that are 10, 11, 12 billion light years away. So if we go to some of these tiny red blobs, which are very red shifted, what we're looking at again is not the light as these galaxies appear today. In fact, we're looking at them as they appeared 12 billion years ago. And in a very real sense, most of these stars and galaxies are either the stars are going to burn out or the galaxies will have been consumed by another galaxy or they don't exist anymore. But again, the point is that we're looking at these things as they appeared 12 billion years ago. And as we continue to go farther and farther away from Earth, eventually we run into the cosmic microwave background radiation. This light was emitted roughly 400,000 years after the beginning of the universe, and it's been propagating towards Earth for that time. And we're seeing it now 14 billion years later. Now, if we try to go farther away, what we run into is a problem. That anything farther away, light will not have had time to propagate from that location to Earth. And so what that means is that we can define an observable universe. And that's the region that is the farthest away that light could propagate from that location to Earth. Now, by definition, Earth is the center of the observable universe. But it's not because we're in any sort of special location. It's because we've defined it's the observable universe for Earth. If we were to go to the Andromeda Galaxy, we could do exactly the same thing, and that observable universe would be offset by 2.5 million light years. So if we can define now the universe we'll talk about it in terms of the observable universe, that's a well-defined quantity, then really all the multiverse is just anything beyond the observable universe. Now that could come up and there's different types of realms you could see there. So our universe could be part of what's just more than what's out. I mean, there's just more stuff out there. So that would be part of the multiverse. Or more likely that when people are talking about the multiverse, they're talking about other universes or other realms where things just look different, where the speed of light is going to be different, or the expansion rate is different, or there's no weak nuclear force. So just moving beyond the observable universe, that's going to be more of the same space-time, matter, and energy as what we see here. But these other bubble universes would be things where the laws of physics might even look different or have a different manifestation. So this is what most people are talking about when they talk about the multiverse. And so it's really just physical realms beyond the observable universe. So, kind of to characterize it a little bit, because the multiverse, how you're envisioning it, impacts with this argument of how do you explain things in different ways. So I think Max Tegmark had a great way of quantifying this. He talks about a level 1 multiverse, and that's just different Hubble volumes or regions just move beyond the edge of our observable universe. And so these are very far away in space, but they largely have the same kind of look to them as we do in our observable universe. Whereas the level 2 multiverse, these are different universes, and they're infinitely far away in space. There's no amount of traveling we could ever do that would ever get us to them. This is typically what people are talking about when they talk about a multiverse. So now the question is, does the multiverse actually explain why we get information? Why there's information and design in the universe? Whoops, hold on there. So does it work? Before I answer that question, I want to first address two bad responses to the multiverse. The first is the multiverse isn't science because it isn't testable. And the reason why this is a bad response is because there are ways that the multiverse is testable. Now, I will admit that there's a little bit of ambiguity about this, because there's aspects of the multiverse that we will never be able to test, but we can actually test for the existence of a multiverse. And here's how. When we look at our universe, in order to explain everything that we see, we've got Big Bang cosmology is very potent in explaining that. But in order to give a good explanation, there needs to be this epoch of inflation. Now, if inflation happens, our universe is far larger than the observable universe. That's just a generic outcome of inflation. If the mechanism scientists have proposed to drive inflation is correct, that mechanism actually produces a multiverse. And so we can, by testing inflation to see whether it happened, and we have good evidence that it does, not just to explain the problems with Big Bang cosmology, but independent of that, we have good evidence that inflation did happen. And if we can understand and test the mechanism by which inflation works, then we do have evidence that a multiverse could exist. So there is a very real aspect where the multiverse is testable, at least in some fashion. Now, it doesn't mean that we can test every aspect of it, but then again, there are other things like that. We can't test every aspect of black holes because we can't get into the black hole and actually test what's going on in there. But we can very much say black holes exist because we can do tests around them and say this is actually the best explanation. So to just say the multiverse isn't science because it isn't testable is not a good response. That requires a whole lot more subtlety and nuance than that statement allows. The other bad response I have heard, and I've actually articulated in the past until I studied this more deeply, is that the multiverse was only invented to escape evidence for God. Now, I'm sure that there are people who like the multiverse because it seems to get rid of the need for a God. But as you look at the history of thought of cosmology over the last 100 years, there were many times where people thought, oh, we've got a way to have another universe, and there just wasn't any scientific support for it, and so the idea just fell out of favor. The reason why it enjoys quite a bit of support today is because if inflation is correct in if the mechanism for inflation is correct, it actually produces a multiverse. And so really the multiverse only became favorable when there were scientific ways to test it and see whether it was a legitimate idea. So, to just go and say, well, to people who posit the multiverse, oh, that's not testable, that's really dismissive and not very respectful of them. And to say it was only invented to get rid of the evidence for God is a misstatement of how it's developed in the past. Now, again, the caveat I would say with both of those is that there are ways people talk about the multiverse to explain things that isn't testable. And there are people who are drawn to the multiverse because they want to get away from God. But that's not universal. That's not always the case. I particularly think the multiverse is testable, and I think a multiverse exists, and I think it actually is evidence for God. So I am a personal example that falls outside these two statements. So just to give a little bit more understanding of why that goes on, or what's going on with inflation. Again, back in the 70s, people recognized that there were these problems with Big Bang cosmology of why was the universe so uniform? Why was it so flat? Why were there no magnetic monopoles? People were wrestling with these questions, and they recognized that a period of very rapid expansion early in the universe could address these, and it actually flowed out of trying to figure out why there were no magnetic monopoles in the universe. The view of inflation, though, was that the universe began, it started to inflate, and then that inflation decayed, and those bubbles grew, and eventually they would coalesce and give the uniform universe that we see. Turns out that does not work. You can show that those bubbles will never coalesce and percolate and collide and give a uniform scenario, and so this was called the graceful exit problem of inflation. Well, in the late 1970s and early 80s, a fellow by the name of Alan Guth came up with a solution to this problem. And what his solution was is that our universe resides inside one of those bubbles. So you've got this inflating space where it decays, you get a bubble, and you get a universe inside that bubble. And that actually gives the uniform cosmic microwave background radiation. It actually solves all of the problems of the homogeneity of the universe, the flatness of the universe. It explains why there's no magnetic monopoles. It gives the cosmic microwave background. It does everything, or it answers all those problems, and there's a lot of experimental or observational data to support it. One thing that also comes out of that is that once inflation happens or starts, it goes on forever. So the picture is you've got this repulsive gravity material, or it's the false vacuum, or there's actually another term for it that I'm drawing a blank on. But it expands, it decays, creates a pocket universe. But while it does, it's actually growing. So the amount of this repulsive gravity material actually stays the same or grows over time. So once it starts, it just produces universes forever into the future. Recognized that, the scientists did, and they thought, well, maybe this has gone on forever into the past. I'm going to pass talking about the quantum multiverse because that's just another way that people look at it. People can ask questions if they want to know about that, but just in the interest of time, I'm going to pass on that. The short answer is, while there are quantum mechanical interpretations that allow for a multiverse, we have at this point really no way to test which interpretation of quantum mechanics is correct. And so any sort of quantum mechanical multiverse is really scientifically speculative, in that the sense that we can't really test whether it's legitimate or the actual way to look at it or not. So when I first heard about the multiverse, my thought was, okay, how do I respond to this? How do I talk about or show that the multiverse doesn't exist? And as I investigated it deeper, what I found is that there's actually a better way to approach it. The more pertinent question, as I see it, is not does the multiverse exist, is does the multiverse eliminate the need for God? Hold on here, I'm having. So if it does, from a naturalistic perspective, if you're going to get rid of God, everything's got to be explained solely by physical laws. And that means that everything that exists has to be self-contained. That means there's no beginning and there's no design. Because if there's a beginning, that implies a beginner. If there's no design, or if there's design, that implies a designer. If the multiverse is going to solve all this, it must explain the observable universe and make testable predictions. Now, in reality, all this is just a statement of, if you want to claim the multiverse is scientific, this must be true. In order to explain everything we see, it must produce sufficient variety, because there are things that we see in our universe that must fall in a narrow range, which in order to make them look natural, there has to be a very wide range with enough fine divisions that we don't look unusual there. So it must produce sufficient variety, and our universe must be one of the possible outcomes. That kind of goes without saying. And this kind of really is a restatement of point one in another way, is that all life must be completely physical. Because in order for the multiverse to explain things, basically what it's going to say is that every possible arrangement of the laws of physics, every possible arrangement of atoms actually happens. And so in order for that to explain life, particularly human life, we must just be an arrangement of atoms. There can't be anything more than that. The arrangement of atoms and how they're moving. So if there's actually some sort of non-physical or immaterial soul to humanity, then the multiverse is not going to explain, our universe is not going to be one of the possible outcomes. Because if humans have a soul and rearranging all the matter isn't going to get a soul, then the multiverse isn't going to answer all the data. And so it won't be self-contained in that sense. So let's look at how well does it do. Well, our observable universe still starts at the Big Bang, even in this level 2 multiverse. But the level 2 multiverse says that the beginning of our universe is nothing unique. So it's kind of, you run things back, there's the Big Bang. That's the boundary between inside the bubble and outside the bubble. That's the beginning of the universe, of our universe. But there are other beginnings as well. So that beginning kind of becomes like Sunday. Sunday is the beginning of the week, but there's nothing particularly unique or remarkable about it. And again, if it goes on forever, maybe these beginnings have gone on forever into the past. Well, as cosmologists researched this, there was a very interesting paper put out by Arvind Bordy, Alan Guth, and Alex Vilenkin. They recognized that inflating spacetimes violated one of the energy conditions that Hawking and Penrose's space-time theorems needed to specify that there was a singularity. And so they said, can we get around that? Or though inflationary mechanisms get around the weak energy condition, is there something else that would specify that there's a past boundary? And it turns out that they recognize that as long as things are expanding sufficiently fast, then, which is true of any sort of inflationary mechanism, then these inflationary spacetimes are incomplete in past directions. Practically speaking, what that means is that if we start today, run the clock backwards, go back in time, eventually we're going to run into a boundary. That boundary looks a lot like a beginning. And so even the multiverse must have a beginning. Now, I will give one brief side caveat here, is that what we don't have is a quantum theory of gravity, which is, in order to truly answer this question of is there a beginning, we need that quantum theory of gravity. But we don't have a quantum theory of gravity, and they're all scientifically speculative in that we don't have any way to test whether they're right or wrong. Some of those quantum theories of gravity don't have a beginning in them, or the beginning looks very different. And I don't want to talk about that would take quite a while, but I will say this, that of the stuff that we can test and put in good conclusions on, it seems like a lot of things point towards even the multiverse must have a beginning. So does the multiverse eliminate the need for God? No, I don't think it does. We still end up with a beginning. You can ask the question, do you end up with design? And I think you could argue for that. And this is part of how. So let's look at how it would explain the existence of information in the multiverse. And again, to articulate it again, the argument that people advance when they're using the multiverse is that, yes, things look designed. There's a very particular configuration when we look at things here in our universe, and it looks unusual. But the multiverse gives us so many rolls of the dice, if you will, so many test trials, or so many trials that we, of necessity, we must be in a region that looks very designed. But when we look at it across the distribution, we're just part of what naturally happens. Stated concisely, it means everything that can happen will happen. So, all right, I was sorry. All right, well, let's just grant that and let's run with that. What are the implications of such a statement? Well, it does pose some problems for the naturalist. For example, in a universe, we are rather rare. You talk about how well the genetic code operates. We talk about the laws of physics and how they are set up for life to exist. You can talk about how you got to have the right kind of star and the right kind of galaxy and the right kind of planet, and there's a sequencing of life, and there's a lot of things that point out and say that we, at least advanced life, may be rare in the universe. We often put probabilities associated with that because a single universe allows us to specify the sample size in some sense. In a multiverse, you can't make those probability arguments anymore because the sample size is just so large. Any sort of probability argument relies on the probability as well as the sample size. And if the sample size is big enough, the probability really doesn't weigh in that hard. So, for example, if I deal out a 5-card hand and I get an ace, king, queen, jack, 10 of spades, there's one, that hand is 1 in 2.5 million. If I deal out 1 and I get it, I'd say, wow, that's unusual. That's rare. If I deal out a billion hands, that hand is going to happen a lot. And the people who get them are the ones that are going to say, wow, this is rare. But in order to have that hand, you've got to be one of the people who got it. And so you're required to see a certain set of circumstances in order to have that hand. So in the multiverse, we have to say things a little differently. It's not, are we rare? The question is, are we typical? Because in a universe, all we have to really deal with is the life like we see here on Earth. That's really all we have to deal with. But in the multiverse, there are actually different ways you can get life. You know, we tend to think of life, again, even just adopting the strictly naturalistic paradigm. Earth formed, somehow original cells and cells came together, or not cells, atoms came together to produce these large molecules and cells. The cells became alive. They grew and diversified into all the stuff that we see. There's this genuine history to life. In the multiverse, there are other kinds of life you have to deal with. There are thermal fluctuations where it's possible for all the air in the room to group up into one corner. It's a very rare possibility. In a single universe, it's never going to happen given that probability. But in a multiverse, there's just so much space, so many samples that it's going to happen somewhere. Well, in those rare events or those thermal fluctuations, it's possible, again, if life is purely physical, that all of the necessary atoms in the right configuration come together and a brain, a disembodied brain sitting off in space, comes into existence and recognizes, oh, I'm alive, and then it poofs out of existence. In a universe, you don't have to worry about that because the probabilities are so small. But in a multiverse, that sort of thing it's going to happen. If it's possible, it's going to happen. Or more likely, another one is, we tend to think that we're an actual history of things. It's possible that, again, if life is purely physical, you can simulate universes. And there may be advanced civilizations that can simulate the universe. And I know this from my work in gamma rays, that I simulated far more gamma rays than I ever detected. And so possibly we're a simulation. So if we're going to use the multiverse to explain the designed, rare, unusual look of life here on Earth, then we're going to have to deal with all these other possibilities as well. And not only that, if I'm just an assembly of a particular set of atoms in a particular way, there's going to be another Jeff Zweerink out there somewhere. And there's going to be another day where we're having a webinar and one where I just decide I'm not going to talk anymore and shut it and go home. If that's true, what does it mean for identity or free will and justice? And again, this is getting a little bit out of the science, but these are things that as people, we hold very strongly to the idea that I have an identity, that I have a capacity to choose, and that justice is important. These things are important to us, but in a multiverse, they have no real meaning to them, or it's very ambiguous what they mean, if they have any meaning at all. And again, and I think it also impacts even what does it mean to do science? Because very often when we're doing science, we're not saying this is the only possible outcome. Really what we're saying is that this is the best explanation or the most likely explanation. Well, again, in a multiverse, if we're using the multiverse to explain how all this information got in DNA and how life arose and all of that, well, then the unusual, unlikely, rare things are happening all the time. And so, again, dumb example, but when I was an undergraduate, I had a lab. We have these tracks where carts would go across the track, and we'd make measurements of how fast it was moving and calculate velocities and accelerations. And there was one of them where we just got a bad data point, and you're asked to talk about errors or put sources of errors on there. And so being kind of snarky undergraduates, my lab partner and I said, well, this must have been a passing black hole. Now, that's dumb. You don't have a passing black hole there, except that in a multiverse, that's one of the possibilities. So that actually is an explanation for what I did. Or what the data we saw. Now, how do I distinguish between that was a passing black hole and the spark on the thing misfired. Because now I can go back and redo the measurement, and it may show that the spark is firing properly, or it may show that the next time the spark didn't, but I have no way of knowing whether this particular one was the spark misfiring or whether it was a passing black hole. So what are we doing when we're doing science if everything happens? Some have said, well, we can talk about things in terms of probabilities, but the reality of it is, in a multiverse, everything happens an infinite number of times. And so it really is unclear that we have any role for science if we're going to use the multiverse to solve the design that we see in the universe. Now, from a Christian perspective, I don't have any problem with this because, if the multiverse, or sorry, let me state that more clearly. From a Christian perspective, I don't think we have that problem, because my identity is because Christ has imbued me, or because God has created Jeff Zweerink with a soul. It's not just a random or a particular assembly of atoms, that there's something non-physical about me. So Jeff Zweerink only exists where God created Jeff Zweerink. And that's true for everyone. So I have an identity. I don't have multiple Jeff Zwerinks out there, some choosing this way, some choosing that way. But when you look at it, it's really everything is already determined. So I actually have free will. The idea of justice makes sense. I don't have to, I'm the design and fine tuning I see actually flows out of how the creator has a purpose of what's going on here. So for a as a Christian, the multiverse doesn't have all these problems. And this is what I found interesting, is that when I first started looking at this, I thought the multiverse was a threat to Christianity, if not to the truth of Christianity, to how I could argue for Christianity. As I looked at it, I realized that the multiverse is actually a bigger threat to the naturalist who wants to say God doesn't exist. Because the multiverse, if you're going to use it to explain all that we see, all the information we see, all the design that we see, beginning of the universe, in order to do that, you're undermining the very tools that the naturalist wants to use. It wants to use his ability to choose, his ability to do science, and his ability to pursue justice and have an identity. So if we're going to undermine the very things they're using to answer the question, that to me is not a very satisfying answer. So who's afraid of the multiverse? I think the naturalist ought to be far more afraid of the multiverse than the Christian is. So I'm going to wrap up there. I will stop sharing my screen and see if we have any comments, questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Zweerink. This is the interactive portion of the program. So the sun's light here. This is the interactive portion of the program. If you would like to interact with Dr. Zweerink about what you've heard, raise disagreement, express your own viewpoint, or ask questions, then now would be the time. You can submit it via the Q&A button at the top of your screen, or you can also click raise hand, and I'll promote you to be a co-panelist with Jeff, and you have opportunity to interact and engage that way as well. You can also submit questions using the Facebook live stream. If you type in a question in the chat window, I will see that I read it to Jeff. Jeff, let me ask you, in regards to the multiverse, I know some physicists have suggested that the multiverse itself would require a certain level of fine-tuning. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I would, and it requires a level of technical detail that's difficult to get into. But what is true is that, so if you're talking about an inflationary multiverse, this mechanism where you've got this inflating space and bubble universes are produced, what often gets missed is that in order to get that inflation to work properly, the inflation potential has to be highly designed. If you look at just kind of generic potentials that would drive that, or to try and drive that, it won't actually drive inflation, or it won't produce the size of universe that we see. So even the inflationary mechanism seems to be fine-tuned. In fact, there is a fairly prominent cosmologist, Paul Steinhardt, who was working with, doing very, research into this area back in the 80s when it was, people were looking at inflation. And part of what convinced him that the inflationary mechanism isn't right is just how finely tuned it is to get it to work. So yeah, I didn't really address that in here, but for even the inflationary mechanism requires quite a bit of fine tuning.
And I think it's important to also stress when someone brings up the idea of a multiverse in relation to, say, explaining the fine tuning or some other design feature of our universe, to point out that it's not just any old multiverse that's required to explain what needs to be explained when we're dealing with design in the universe. We need, a multiverse in which each of the universes is based on the same physics as in our universe to make them relevant to explaining the parameters and constants that pertain to the physics of our universe. And we need, as you mentioned, we need variability in the different constants and parameters. We need almost infinite array of parallel universes to get around to some of the more impressive fine-tuning feats, such as the initial low entropy conditions of our universe, that,
right.
And so on. And we need also, there's no guarantee that just having an infinite amount of universes will explore all parameter space in any case, because you need first.
Yes. Well, and you raise an important point, and I made a statement that the existence of the multiverse is testable. Mm-hmm. What isn't testable, at least in the foreseeable future, maybe at all, is to ask the question, what does the multiverse actually look like? So mm-hmm. I think that if we find that our mechanism for inflation works, that would reasonably argue that a multiverse exists. Now, if you're going to use inflation to, or inflation and all these other universes to explain the fine-tuning of our universe, that means that all these other universes have to look a certain way. Well, but in order to use that explanation, you're assuming what they will look like. You have to assume, it could be that all of these all these other universes look exactly like ours for no reason. There's no way to experimentally or to test that experimentally one way or the other. And so, your statement is correct, and I think that's where you're using the multiverse to solve all these things. I think that's where it moves into the untestable realm, at least at this point. Yeah. I mean, it may be 10, 15, 20 years in the future we'll solve or figure out some way to do that. But what you get out of the multiverse tends to be what you put into it. And in that sense, it's not testable.
Yeah, exactly. And you said earlier in the talk that you think one of the bad objections to the multiverse is, well, it's not science because it's not testable. But in fact, the relevant properties of the multiverse to explaining fine-tuning and so on, those properties are untestable because there's no way to test that you have sufficient number of parallel universes, as I understand, or that they have sufficient parameter variability, or that they're based on the same physics as in our universe. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say that you could make a reasonable, or it's reasonable for you to say that perhaps the multiverse has the variability it needs to explain. That's a reasonable statement. Yeah. But it's no more reasonable than all of the universes look exactly like ours. And there's no test we could do to decide which one is correct. And so there's this whole slew of reasonable statements we could make. But for the naturalist to get rid of God in that sense, he has to show that all of these, that there's this actual variability. And we're going to have no way to test whether that variability exists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's three hypotheses, I think, that can account for the fine-tuning and design features of our universe. There's the chance hypothesis, and then there's a physical necessity hypothesis, and then there's the design hypothesis. And if it were the case that each of these parallel universes had exactly the same parameters and constants as in our universe, then we might suspect, well, it's due to physical necessity. It just has to be that way. In which case, if there was some governing law or principle which determined why the constants and parameters just had to be the way they are out of physical necessity, it would be a remarkable coincidence that it just so happened to be it just so happens that the physical constraints in the universe just so happen to be that which is conducive to life forms such as ourselves, which within itself entail a design inference.
Well, so I guess the way I would characterize it is this, that I don't have evidence that would compel a naturalist to say that God exists, in the sense that I cannot rule out every possibility where you might be able to say, well, this explains it, this explains it. I can't do that. I could give arguments that I think this is a better explanation. But to the naturalist who wants to come and say, oh, we've got the multiverse, that explains all the fine tuning, there's a whole lot of assumptions they've made in there that they can't justify, or that they can't justify any better than I'm coming along and saying, hey, I think the best explanation is that a creator fashioned all this for us. And in that sense, they're making a metaphysical statement, and then very often they're getting upset at me for making a metaphysical statement. And so in some sense, it's just saying, let's recognize that we don't have a definitive answer, and you can't commandeer and say, oh, science says we don't need God, or science says God doesn't have any place in here. And that gives a role where Christians, I think, to me, this isn't so much about how do you build the best case so that people all have to believe this. What I want to do is to show that Christians have a place at the table where we can come in, be fully engaged with our minds, do good science, and fully committed followers of Christ, and that we're in that table and that we actually have valuable contributions. I think that's a far more beneficial approach than trying to build a case that everybody's got to live and abide by this. I think that's good. My experience has been that asks me to engage in conversations with the gospel and bring people, or help people know what the gospel has to say and consider the claims of Christ. And that's really, I think, my interest in driving in this. I think you can make a strong case that the best explanation for what we see is that God created things. The God created, fashion, and design things. But I am far more interested in how do I engage in those conversations with people and equip them to see and want and desire that relationship with Christ himself. So
one of the things I'd also say in regards to when someone invokes the multiverse as an alternative explanation for the design features of our universe, the design hypothesis has not just the greatest explanatory power in terms of explaining one set of observations, but rather it also has explanatory scope, and it explains multiple sets of observations across multiple disciplines. So it explains the cosmic fine-tuning of the universe. It explains also the fine-tuning of the genetic code, as you mentioned, the orders of information, rich systems in biology, and a whole range of other different areas. So would you say that would you make that argument as one counter to the multiverse as an explanation?
Yes and no. I would say, I think there's a lot of evidence for design. I'm on record as saying that, and I've made those arguments a lot. One place where I'm hesitant and always just careful to see is that I'll take the example of a flat universe. We could argue 30 years ago that our universe was close to flat. I'm going to get to Lizzie's question here in a few minutes, just so you know, that our universe was flat, and that the geometry of a flat geometry is very unstable, and that required the mass density of the universe to be fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 60 very early in the universe. And so, that's an argument for design and fine-tuning, and it looked like it could be chance. There didn't seem to be any reason for it to be that way, so it wasn't necessity, and therefore it looked like design. In the 80s and 90s, what people recognized is that inflation actually drives the universe incredibly close to flat. And so what looked like design actually somewhat becomes necessity, except that now the design moves over into the inflationary potential, not into the flatness of the geometry of the universe. And so there's just a part of this where when we talk about the laws of physics being designed, we don't know what the realm of possibilities is. We don't know what the range of options is. We don't know what the probabilities of different configurations are. And so to ask the question of whether this is necessity, we don't have any way of answering that with any sort of definitude. And so if the design relies on, well, it's not necessity and it's not chance, I have hard time ruling out not necessity in this case. And so I have those two tensions balanced in my mind, that something that looks designed now, as a general rule, most physicists, when they see really big numbers, really big probabilities against, that's a sign that they don't understand something. And so part of my approach is a utilitarian approach, is that there are people who say, yeah, that really does look fine-tuned, and then I'm great there. But then I recognize there are others who look at that and say, rather than say that's fine-tuned, they'll say that's a sign we don't understand something. There may be something that drives it. There's a necessity that we don't understand. And very often that's a fruitful avenue for helping us understand things better. And so that's kind of the tension I have, or the balance I play in my mind, is that rather than trying to articulate this in a very clear-cut, irrefutable way, which I have trouble doing, I'm wrestling with what's engaging with this person, and to where that's engaging, I'm there. To where it's not, I recognize there's another way to argue this that doesn't tie me into, well, it's not necessity, it's not chance, it's got to be design. So
sure.
So if I just want to really quickly, since I was on that example, Lizzie asked a question. Can you give a simple analogy for the inflationary problem that means the multiverse requires fine tuning? And so the example I would give is that the inflation is in a very high potential, and then when it comes down, it's going to go to a low potential. And so the example would be, you put a ball on top of a hill. Ball rolls down the hill. That's just simple. There's nothing fancy about that. If I now need to get that ball into a hole that's up another hill, I have to design the hill so that the ball gets the right speed and it goes in the right path and ends up dropping in the hole. Inflation kind of has a potential like that. It's not just let's roll downhill. It's got to be the right kind of hill that doesn't go too fast. It doesn't slope too steeply. It doesn't steep or it's not too shallow. It comes out. It's got this, the low state is out around, not at the center. It's just a very weird looking hill, if you will. And so, hopefully that's a little bit helpful, but it's got to go from a high potential to a low potential, but it's not just let's roll downhill. It's got to roll downhill and hit a number of balls, and it can't go too fast and it can't go too slow. And then it's got to get up the other side and drop in the hole with just the right velocity. That's kind of an analogy of what you might have to do, except it's actually a lot more fine-tuned than that.
Right.
I don't know, you kind of froze there for just a second, so I don't know whether you were talking or not. Oops. Lost your video there. There we go.
Okay, great. That didn't happen there. Okay, yeah, that was a good response to Lizzie's question. I often like to formulate the fine-tuning argument in Bayesian terms. So basically, to argue that evidence, as understood to a Bayesian, can be defined as evidence is evidence for your hypothesis H if and only if the probability of E is greater given H than given non-H. So, for instance, in a forensic setting, the presence of the accused's fingerprints on the murder weapon is to be taken as evidence for the guilt hypothesis over the non-guilt hypothesis, because the evidence is far more probable on the guilt hypothesis than it is on the non-guilt hypothesis, right?
Right.
So in a similar way, on theism, on classical theism, we expect a kind of a moral arena like we observe around us to exist. It's something which is not very surprising on theism. But it's something which is extraordinarily surprising on atheism. And so, all other things being held equal, the existence of fine-tuning and design features of our universe are strong indicators of design over the non-design hypothesis, I would argue.
Yeah, and I would agree. And I guess, you know, I've had people who kind of respond against that, and you know, I would agree with your position there. So this is, I'm sympathetic. The thing that I wrestle with, though, is that it's the response I've heard, is that it's difficult to evaluate those because we're the tool evaluating them. And our existence here demands that we see a certain configuration. The universe has got to look a certain way, or our existence demands that the universe looks a certain way. You know, and so you can see where the multiverse kind of capitalizes on that to the naturalist and says, well, yeah, we've got to see things a certain way. There's just a lot of options out there. Of necessity, we see the one that's capable of supporting us here. So they would put the laws of physics look the way they do, or the strength of the electromagnetic force compared to the strong nuclear force. They would say, yes, it looks like it's designed, but given our existence, that's a requirement. So I can't use that as that isn't evidence of design. That's just a requirement of me being here. And so there's just people that argument doesn't resonate with. And so, you know, kind of what I see my job as an apologist is to, you know, have a suite of tools that this sort of discussion may resonate with this person, or it may not. But if it doesn't, I still have other ways to talk with them about it. And, you know, so I give lots of talks where I talk about how the universe looks designed and fine-tuned, and that points to a crater. And then there are people who it just doesn't register with them. And so then I began asking and talking with them and say, all right, well, where are you? And what does interest you, or what does resonate with you? And I'm less interested in winning the design argument than I am, how do we start talking about who Christ is, and let's consider what he has to say about our lives. So, but I think the design argument is a very powerful one.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about John Leslie's response to the anthropic principle that you just mentioned? So John Leslie, a famous philosopher, used the sharpshooter thought experiments, where basically, in the analogy, you're taken and you're blindfolded and you're placed before an army of trained marksmen, and you hear all of their guns go off, and then your blindfold is removed and you're still alive, and you think for a moment, that's surprising. How come they all missed? And then you realize, yes, of course, it's no surprise that I'm still alive, because if I was dead, I wouldn't be here wondering why I'm still alive.
Right.
So it doesn't get you off the hook of having to explain the surprising sets of observations, even though if the sets of observations didn't exist, we couldn't be here to observe them.
But this is where I think the multiverse, again, you know, for the naturalist who, you know, maybe somewhat inclined to not consider God, or where it thinks there's a real high burden of proof you have to put on. In a multiverse, the sharpshooter or the guy in that scenario, if that happened once, that's not a good conclusion to draw. But if you now have this scenario where you know that a lot of people are, you know, there's a lot of sharpshooters out there, a lot of scenarios like yours, occasionally that's going to happen. You know, so it does make that more reasonable. You know, and again, I guess I'll just go back to, I know that sometimes I'll be in our discussions with skeptics, and they'll put forth an argument that they think just has a great amount of weight. And I look at it, it's like, I just don't see that carries a lot of weight. And it's just not something, either I don't understand it, which is possible, or they misunderstand my worldview in a way that's just not a problem. You know, so if they argue, well, this is just so incredible, or, you know, how could God possibly do this? Well, to me, that doesn't resonate a lot, because my job as a scientist, as a Christian, is to understand what God did. I don't get to stand in judgment of whether that was a good idea, bad idea. So if you're saying, well, this doesn't make sense that God would do it this way, I'm like, well, that's not my job. So that sort of argument wouldn't resonate with me. And so, you know, I think there are people, because the multiverse has grown in popularity, that the sharpshooter argument, I agree. I think that's just not a good argument, but I can understand why the naturalist would say, well, yeah, there's a lot in the multiverse that makes it a more reasonable thing to say, because there are scenarios where I got shot, but the one where I'm here is of necessity no longer does that. And so I think we just need to figure out how to engage that a little differently.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that the anthropic principle it only carries potency when combined with the multiverse scenario, because then you can say, well, we just happen to be in, we'd have to be occupying the one universe, which is conducive to life. But Lizzie Schofield also asks, I get the fine-tuning argument if there was one universe, but doesn't the existence of a multiverse mean that there are so many probabilities that probability itself becomes meaningless? That was one of your points, right?
That is one of my points. And again, the way the multiverse is talked about, it's not just things are very large. Very often, this is talked about as though, our universe is, even our bubble universe is now spatially infinite in this scenario. And so it's not just comparing, how many stars there are. Well, there's an infinite number of stars of every size in a spatially infinite universe like that, where things are roughly like ours. And so comparing probabilities amongst infinites is very difficult, if not impossible thing to do. So I think your point is well taken, that in some sense, given the way they're proposing the multiverse, probabilities do kind of become meaningless. As a Christian, I find that less problematic, because there are other things that anchor why science works and things that we kind of relied on probabilities as being important. Whereas to the naturalist, I think that just ultimately becomes self-defeating. That the things that they want to say and do, they're undermining the very foundation for making those statements.
Because the multiverse really has infinite explanatory power. And so that makes it ad hoc. If it can explain any set of observations, then really it doesn't do a very good job of explaining anything, because you can invoke it arbitrarily to explain whatever you want to explain, right?
Which is exactly why science wouldn't work. Because in science, what we're doing is we're saying, well, we could imagine these possibilities. Let's actually determine which one actually happened. Yeah. And if that requires being able to say either one, that for every scenario, I could give you multiple explanations of what caused it. But ultimately, the question I'm asking is, which one's the most likely? Which one explains this the most simply? Well, in a multiverse, you can't answer, or you can't apply those criteria anymore, because somewhere that scenario, you said if it could happen, it did happen. And you have no way of knowing whether it happened here or not. So I think that really does undermine the very fabric or the foundations of science, which is not something the naturalist wants to do, because they're making an argument that science eliminates the need for God. So.
And another way I think that this multiverse proposal is corrosive to science, in addition to that, is, as you mentioned earlier, the Boltzmann brain problem. And as a naturalist who subscribes to the multiverse, I think one is more rational to believe oneself to be a Boltzmann brain than one is to believe that we exist in a finely tuned universe and we are in fact complex life forms, right. Because it's far more probable on that viewpoint that you would get a single observer fluctuate into existence out of the quantum vacuum than that you would get a universe complete with all of the intricacies and fine-tuned parameters and constants that we observe in our universe, right? Right.
No, that's very much the case. And Sean Carroll, who's done quite a bit of work and speaks fairly popularly on things, he argues that Boltzmann brains are, I think the term he uses is cognitively unstable, because you recognize that again, the probabilities are difficult to actually address, but in most scenarios, it seems like the Boltzmann brains are more likely than normal, ordinary observers like we would consider ourselves. Now, a Boltzmann brain, the most likely Boltzmann brain, is not one that has this long history and everything's well ordered. It's a fluctuation where the history is imagined. And so if it's more likely we're a Boltzmann brain, then all the memories we have are really non-existent. That's the most likely scenario. And so we can't even trust our ideas about what's going on if we're a Boltzmann brain. But what I find interesting is his solution to that. So what he does is he looks at the different scenarios we have out there, and he applies a criteria that any universe that produces bolts and brains isn't a good model. Well, that's designing things. It's saying, all right, in this scenario, or of the possible outcomes, we're eliminating the ones where you got bolts and brains. Well, I could also go and say, in my models out here, I'm going to eliminate all the possibilities where carbon doesn't exist. That's how you end up with, that's how we ended up with some of our fine-tuning arguments for the laws of physics. Well, to me, it seems like all he's doing is just designing things so that we don't get those unworkable scenarios. But that's still design. Or that's fine-tuning, design, purpose, whatever you want to call it. It's still being applied there. So, as I've looked at this, a lot of times, we'd have this particular design argument or this particular argument for fine-tuning, and we kind of squeeze on that, and scientists might solve that, but that design ends up popping up somewhere else. So it used to be the flatness of the geometry of the universe, and now it's in the inflation potential. It seems like it's always there. It just, we can kind of squeeze one part and seem to get rid of it. Oftentimes it says, all right, we've solved things, and not recognizing that it just tends to pop up somewhere else. So I think it's hard to put that into an argument or quantify it or stuff, but it seems like that happens very regularly. And I can give you numerous examples where that's happened. So.
Right. If a multiverse really exists and has the explanatory power that naturalists suppose, then if for instance there's a card game going on in our universe, and there's say 10 people around the table, and there's a card dealer, and I'm dealt say a royal flush in poker, which is the best hand every round for say 20 rounds, and I start to get, and the other players start to get suspicious that there's some stacking of the deck going on. And I might say, well, it's not actually that unexpected, because remember, we live in a multiverse, and there's all these other parallel universes, in fact, an infinite number. And so there's an infinite number of other universes in which we're all playing poker around this table. And we just happen to be in the universe where I'm dealt a royal flush every round. So it kind of commits that sort of fallacious thinking. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think it's right. I don't know how to quantify or articulate that, but there's something about that explanation that just doesn't sit right, because we do think in terms of what do I expect here, and there's that just is not what you expect there. And so to just claim, oh, we live in a multiverse, that's what's weird about it, I just don't see that as a good explanation. Now, that being said, you could actually sit down and deal with that many hands, and at the end of the day, we'd have to say, wow, that's just really unusual, So I think at the end of the day, that using the multiverse, or if we can articulate what are the consequences of invoking the multiverse to solve all of these fine-tuning problems, quote unquote problems, that leads to some rather bizarre consequences that I think a lot of people will look and say, I'm not willing to live there. For example, I remember listening to Sean Carroll talk about, well, there's other Sean Carrolls out there. And he goes, well, I don't have to worry about them. But what that means is that, if you now take the distribution, there's a whole slew of distributions of Sean Carrolls, some who are Caltech physicists, some who are, janitors at McDonald's, some who are drunks and in jail, some who are Nobel Prize winners, some who are concert pianists. And at the end of the day, he's just part of a distribution, and the distribution is determined. There was no, I made choices to get here where I was. It's just everything ends up being deterministic at some level. And it's just this illusion of him being able to choose. That's the sort of scenario I think you end up with in there. Yeah. So, and that's going to trouble a lot of people.
And of course, in one of those universes, Richard Dawkins is the Pope, and Sam Harris.
It does have to be possible, it does have to be possible. So.
Yes, Richard Dawkins is the Pope, and Sam Harris is a mega church pastor at some big church in America. So
Yeah.
yeah, it leads to these absurd conclusions that everything is actualized. And as you said, yes, it does seem to make everything ultimately deterministic because every possibility is ultimately realized an infinite number of times.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you think that in order to evade the fine-tuning problem, you really need an actual infinite number of parallel universes? I think a finite number would suffice, provided you have enough, right?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it depends on what sort of probabilities you're talking about. I mean, if something's 1 in a million, if you got a million shots, then you get that one. That becomes typical, or it's not unusual at that point. And so, if the probability grows, then you need more and more samples. But the reason I made that statement is that when you read the literature, when people are talking about how large is our universe and how many bubbles are out there, they talk about our universe being spatially infinite, and they talk about this going on forever. So I'm just adopting the terminology, and again, we don't have a way of measuring that one way or the other. So where possible, I adopt the assumptions and the things they make, and then say, all right, how can I respond in that context in a way that might be persuasive or carry weight with this person?
I mean, do you think an actual infinite number of universes is philosophically possible? Because I think there's good philosophical arguments against an actual infinite number of things, right?
Yeah, this is an ongoing discussion I've had with my philosopher, theologian friend, Ken Samples. I know there's a book, I'm forgetting the exact name of it. Zondervan put it out. It's a dictionary of Christianity and science. And I actually wrote the article on infinities in there. And this is what I've come to as I've looked at that. So where we look at that, I can provide you a mathematically coherent way to talk about infinite things. I can talk about sorry, I'm just trying to think how to articulate this quickly or clearly. I think there are a number of philosophical problems that people have raised against them, like how do you traverse an infinite sort of thing. But I do wonder if I haven't seen anything that says actual infinities are impossible. What I do see them arising is that our ways of thinking have to change. For example, I can say, anything where I add 2 objects to 2 objects and I get 5, in a finite system, that doesn't make any sense. But in an infinite system, your arithmetic changes. So just because I get weird arithmetic in some sense when I look at finite sections of infinite systems, that doesn't mean that the infinite can't exist. So what I would say is this, that anything that is infinite cannot be subdivided into a finite set of finite groups. Anything that is finite will never grow to be infinite. But it's unclear to me, or I'm unwilling to say at this point, that God could not create a spatial or something infinite. I think he has that capacity.
But on the inflation model, which predicts a multiverse, you do have kind of finite becoming an infinite if you take the infinite view of the multiverse.
I think I think you are correct. In that scenario, it's that there's this gets into a number of discussions about space and time and being independent, and are they blocks or are they actually growing, those sorts of things. But the way the inflationary model produces spatially infinite universes actually it's a potential infinite, not an actual infinite. That is correct.
Yeah. So,
or at least that's correct as according to how I understand it. So.
Sure. So it's not necessarily the case that every possibility is actualized then.
That could be true, and that's one of the places where we don't have any way to test that. We know that the universe must be at least so large, and that's actually larger than the observable universe, or else there would be some effects of it being just the size of the observable universe that we don't see. But we know that it's got to be at least so large, but we don't know. So there's a minimum size that we can put on it, but there's no maximum size we can put on it. And so it's an unanswered question. and it may forever be unanswerable.
Yeah, well, what would you say if we're talking about, say, the fine-tuning argument in an evangelistic or apologetic setting, and someone brings up the multiverse as the standard, canned rebuttal to the fine-tuning argument, what would you say would be the top objections you would bring up with that person to the multiverse response?
I think the first thing I would do is I would try and investigate with that person what in their mind is the big issues that are going on here. So when I talk with someone, I'll put ideas out there, and I'll talk about it seems like the multiverse is designed because you got to deal with all these other kinds of life. And they may just say, that's no big deal to me. And I might explore that a little bit. But I spend a lot of time trying to understand where the other person's coming from, what resonates with them, what things are important to them. Quite honestly, it may be that they may say, I just don't think the fine-tuning argument is that relevant. The multiverse solves that. And ultimately, what we end up doing is we kind of discuss that for a little bit and then get around to, well, how does the multiverse impact whether Christianity is right or wrong? And so let's just have a discussion of, well, if the multiverse is true, why does that get rid of the need for God? Couldn't God do this? And so that might be the more productive discussion that evening. So I don't think of it in terms of, well, this person doesn't like this, how do I overcome that? I think a person could not think the universe is designed and yet still believe that God exists and created us. So I'm really more interested in getting to that discussion about who God is, who Christ is, and what do we deal with him, than I am about dealing with any particular argument.
So how would you transition from the fine-tuning argument to dealing with Christ and the gospel?
Again, it's going to vary. A lot of people, or let's see here. A lot of that is just trying to understand where the person is and where God's at work. I've had people who've had discussions with me about Christianity because they just thought it was weird that I could be a thinking person and a Christian at the same time. And so that was the discussion we had. I've had people who are just, you could just tell they're kind of aggressive and want to attack. And so I end up just talking about what they're interested in and what do they do, and kind of looking for places where just kind of being sensitive to where could I introduce a principle here, is like, where they're passionate about, they're just amazed with the beauty of creation or of the universe. And I do, it's like, I might throw in there, I'm fascinated too. I think that to me is an evidence that God's created it, that he wants us to know him. And, just kind of probing where are they interested in discussing what Christianity has to say. I guess I have just personally found that where I go, where I've had an approach of these are the arguments I want to talk about, trying to bring those into the conversation, it's a very stilted conversation for me. I don't know why that is. I haven't figured out whether that's me personally or whether that's normal or people in general. But where I'm interested and engaged with the other person and thinking about what they're saying and responding and being willing to step in and make a statement about God and Christianity and not worried about being attacked or not knowing all the answers, those are where the vast majority of the fruitful conversations I've had. It comes in the context of relationship, not so much a particular argument. Now, as a speaker, I have to develop, when I'm talking to an audience, I can't do that with a specific person. And so I see my role as equipping people with different things they can take into the conversation. As they know, then they're equipped to be in those conversations. But my personal experience has been where I have those conversations are in relationships.
Right. Mark McGee in Alabama says, you mentioned earlier about Christians having a seat at the table and having something to add to the discussion. What would you recommend for university students trying to get a seat at the discussion tables at their schools, including discussions with professors who exclude Christians from their tables?
So what I would, my first kind of anecdotal piece of evidence to that is, I do research over at UCLA, and it's known that I'm a Christian over there, and I can, based on how people have responded to me, I can say pretty confidently that, I can bring up talks about Christianity. My viewpoints can be known. They can be discussed. They'll be referenced without any discussion at times. Seems like what gives me a place at the table is that I do good science. So I'm there working. I have done that. I've engaged. I'm doing things that advance what we know scientifically, and I do good scientific work. That, to me, or as I've talked to other Christians and other people who are not Christians, that seems to be the single biggest thing for giving me a place at that table. And so, a fair bit of that is building the relationship that, my boss over at UCLA knows that he can give me projects and I'll go do good work for him. And so that now, when we talk about, whether we go to church or whether people, God exists, when we're in those conversations, we're having a discussion about things, and I belong at the table because of my scientific work. So what I would encourage is, if we want to be able to influence scientists or people who have a scientific background, is we've got to be very good about our science. So kind of strategically, I'm going to say things that may upset a few people here, but I know that one of the most unusual conferences I ever went to was back in the 90s. There was Kansas was one of the one of the states in the United States where there was it was either the whole Kansas school board or some city, I think it was the whole state of Kansas, had tried to put into their curriculum at the high school level something that talks about how God exists, or who, what would have been termed at the time an intelligent design curriculum of some sort. And at the annual national APS meeting, American Physical Society meeting, they gave a plenary session to a guy who got up there just to talk about how do you deal with creationists. That it was something that the process that had played out there actually had poisoned the water, so that this was no longer a discussion, it was a battle. And so a lot of my thought is, how can, as a Christian who's in this environment, how can I diffuse the battle, diffuse the heat, so that we can have a discussion instead of it being a battle? And I guess that's really what drives me in a lot of that. And so the way to have a place at the table is to, I spend a lot of time just asking people questions, trying to understand and articulate to them that I understand what they're saying, I care about who they are, and that I actually understand what they're trying to communicate to me. And then, because what I often find with most people is that when you understand them, they're willing to be heard by you. I try and figure out, how can I help them think about what they believe more deeply? I just know personally that where I have changed my viewpoint on things, the person who's done that has helped me learn to think about, or to analyze more deeply, why do I think that's true? And so my apologetic arguments are not for the purpose of building a case. It's to try and figure out, what is it that resonates with this person that helps them think, why do I think that? How do I go back and think more deeply about that? Because those are the places where God is working in my life and allows me to actually make a change about things. So a lot of that is not, it's a lot of social dynamics. You got to have the scientific understanding and you got to have the knowledge to be there. But a lot of that is just being able to be, interact socially there, and recognizing that there are times where people are just going to be antagonistic. And as a Christian, I don't get that luxury. So.
And this is one of the reasons, by the way, that at the Apologetics Academy, I often bring on some of the leading critics and opponents of the gospel to give presentations, because I fear that often not just Christians, but people of all religious persuasions are guilty of tunnel vision, and that we only expose ourselves to viewpoints we already agree with. And so
Yes.
I think that by listening and interacting with people who are educated, well-informed, intelligent, and hold different views from ourselves, it encourages us to think more deeply about why we think the way we do. And so that's the purpose that I bring on some of the leading critics of the faith to give webinars for us.
No, I think that's incredibly important, and I applaud that tremendously, because if there's a single guiding statement to how I approach this, is I was interacting with a pastor that I was at the church that I attended during undergraduate and graduate school, and one of the points he made was to never argue against a point until you understand it well enough to argue for it. And what you're talking about is, let's bring people in, let's understand what they have to say, because then, one, you're dealing with what their questions and what their issues really are, but also it's a way of communicating value and respect to them, that, wow, you actually understood what I have to say, as opposed to just throwing up your arguments and thinking you're right without considering me. And I know for me personally, someone who understands me gets a lot more of my attention and thought, and I consider what they say a lot more deeply.
Yeah. Douglas Feather in the Q&A asks, one answer I've given to multiverse being an answer to the fine-tuning is that it would imply that we would live in a minimal life-supporting universe, and such a universe would be no larger than one galaxy, probably a lot smaller. This clearly isn't such a universe.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of assumptions, and I think your point is right, and that's really what, as people are wrestling with the Boltzmann brains, there's the what is required and what is extraordinary. And so, the minimum Boltzmann brain is just the one that pops into existence and recognizes it's there. If we're a Boltzmann brain and we're not one of those, we're really unusual. And so your statement is kind of along the lines of, the minimal universe that could support life would be what we would expect to be in, and the fact that we're in a pretty extravagant universe is against that. The rebuttal to that I would see that would actually carry a little bit of weight with me is that in order to get a universe that, or you ask the question, what's the minimal universe that actually supports everything? It actually has to be as large as the one we see. And so I think that would be one response I would offer if I were skeptical of your response there. So I think you could make an argument that the universe actually has to be about as large as it is in order to get the hydrogen, the carbon, the oxygen, the nitrogen so necessary for life, in order for multiple generations of stars. Given the laws of physics, the universe seems to need to be this large in order for it to support life. So it looks like we're wrapping up. I will, if anybody either post a chat or if anybody has a question there. Okay, we've got a question from Ashley. It says, when you say that you're helping people think about why they believe what they believe, what do you mean by this? You mean you ask lots of questions, or do you introduce polemics into the conversation, or both? Also, how do you get from this to the gospel? So a lot of it is just asking a lot of questions. Most of the people I meet, these are not relationships that I've had for a while. And so it is just kind of asking and inquiring, what do they do? Why do they find that fascinating? Why do what do you find interesting in thinking about this? So it is spent a lot of time trying to figure out what's going on, and then figuring out how to ask that question that helps them to get to think deeper. It may be as simple as, they're talking about, well, Christianity can't be right because people don't, that's not a good example. That doesn't ever come up. But how could a good God allow evil in the world? And then being equipped with a discussion of that, so you say, well, why is evil a problem in the world? It may be that they think that evil doesn't exist because God doesn't exist. More likely than not, they think that evil actually exists, but they don't like that and how that fits with God. And so it's asking the question, well, is it not possible that evil in the world really just flows out of people having a free will? you know, and so that may be a discussion in there. Well, it's like, so it's just spending a lot of time asking questions and occasionally throwing in saying, hey, well, hey, this is what Christianity says. Is this a problem for you? Or what do you think about that? And why do you think God can't do that? Or why do you think this, that, or the other? And it's, I can't say I have, oh, this is, you know, this is the set of questions that I found helps people think. It often flows out of just being willing to listen to what God is opening up. And very often the way it practically plays out is we're going through a conversation and some thought about how to connect that with the gospel comes up, and that I've got a choice there. Either I can step out in boldness and ask the question, or I can just let it slide and sit more comfortably. That's personally the way it plays out most of the time for me.
Awesome. Let's see, are there any more questions that people in the audience want to ask? If not, we'll start to wrap up. Either submit via the Q&A box, or you can raise hand. If there are no questions, then probably now would be a good time to wrap up.
Oh, there was a question there that just answered by Ashley Charles, just asked that we just answered, so in the Q&A box.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Jeff, for coming on. It's been a real honor to have you. Thanks for giving up your day, your afternoon to talk to us about this topic. It's been really fascinating. Good.
Well, I've enjoyed it. Thanks for taking the effort to organize it all. This has been a lot of fun. Maybe we can do it again in the future.
Yes. Yes, definitely. All right. Well, I'll see you guys all next week. We'll be talking about undesigned coincidences, and I'll be giving a presentation on that subject. All right. See you guys. Bye, everyone.